I am Daniel Hughes and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He is the author of several books, no other than Mr. Cody C. Engdal.
They want to get right about 80,000 words is the Goldilocks. So if you think about that, if you follow my system to the minimum, you're going to be at 80,000 words in 8 months. And that's great. And I think it's a good pacing to have to put out a book. I would say everywhere between 6 months to 2 years. So following that right there will get your book written.
So, Mr. Cody, how important is outlining before diving into writing the first draft?
It is somewhat important. It's somewhat important. We have people who are pantsers and we have plotters, right? I think that's the nomenclature. And I think you use something else. He's gardeners and I can't remember, but the metaphor is the same. There are some people who plan every single aspect of their book out. They outline everything, so all they have to do is flesh it out. There are some people, pantsers, who go by the seat of their pants. George R. Martin is famous for this. He's the guy who wrote the Game of Thrones. Uh, I'm not knocking either one. I kind of believe in the Goldilocks philosophy of somewhere in between of two extremes is the correct path, the right path. So I definitely, when I sit down to write a novel, I have done some plotting. I have an idea. I know how it ends. I think that's more important. It's more important to know how it ends than knowing how it begins because if you know how it ends, then you're writing towards something. So usually when I sit down and write a book, I have an idea of, okay, this is where I want this to end. This is how I want it to begin. And these are the things that I want to happen in between. And what happens with me, and I've written, let's see, I'm starting my sixth novel in a couple days, is that I usually get mostly the book I had in mind when I start, but that book has definitely evolved as I've written it. So not just planning books, but all things in life. I think that it's good to go into things with a loose plan. It's good to have a plan, but a flexible plan so that you can pivot when there are contingencies and when there are opportunities. And my books are all, it's funny. My book, the Mexico My Love, several months after I published it, I found an old outline that I had written before I started writing the book, and it was a very different story that I had in mind, and I'm very happy with the story I ended up with. So I think that's why I say somewhat important. You should do it, but don't be a slave to it.
What techniques can help in developing compelling and believable characters?
I think first of all, you should always be reading. You should always be reading other people's books, especially in your own genre. And one of my favorite author coaches out there, Claire Taylor. If you don't know who she is, you should look her up and then do everything she tells you to do. She has a great quote. She says, "If you don't have time to read, you don't have time to write." So I think reading is very important. And I think also I collect a lot of personality traits just from my life, like people I know. Nobody in my book is exactly somebody I know in real life, but I've used little bits of other people's personalities and sometimes even my own to color in some of my characters. So I think having an, a feel for the human condition and how people are, and being an observer of human behavior, even people that you don't like, there are things about them that are interesting. That if you're constantly looking at people, at what is it that motivates this person, I think you can write that into your characters.
Certainly. So, how does one choose the right setting for their story, and why is it important?
Yeah, I think the setting is one of the characters itself, especially as a historical novelist. Setting is very important to me. In fact, I think I start with the setting. Like, for example, when I first decided, okay, enough of talking about it, enough of false starts, I'm going to write my first book. I decided I was going to write about the American Civil War. And the reason why I picked that is because it had a built-in audience. There's a big following, I guess, a fandom of historical uh, fans, people, enthusiasts that follow it, and there's a lot of research in it, and it's because it's interesting. So I think I'm not quite sure with other genres because I think other genres are driven by things, but certainly in the historical genre, the setting's kind of set for us. We decide, well, I want to write a book about, for example, I just got done reading Anthony Doerr's All the Light We Cannot See, which is a great book, by the way. It's a World War II book. So the setting's kind of set, and it is a character into itself. World War II Europe, the Emerald Coast of Brittany, the coal mining towns of Germany, all are characters, and not only are they characters themselves, but they guide the characters and they form the characters. And if you think about it, Daniel, you're a product of where you grew up. You're a product of where you were born, how you were raised, and the place that you grew up and went to school. So, yeah, I think if you think about setting as important as your characters, I think you'll write very good books.
Well done, Mr. Cody. So, what are the effective ways to build a plot that keeps readers engaged from beginning to end?
I think the effective way is to have an ending in mind. It's to have something to write towards. Now, there will be people who disagree with me, and they're not wrong. There are pantsers who usually character driven stories tend to, like, someone comes with a character and then just kind of lets the character guide the story. I write books that are kind of fatalistic, in which the my characters are driven towards an inexorable conclusion. And for me, I think that's what drives the story, because your character is moving more and more. You got to do it in a believable way, because the the pitfall of that is sometimes it can seem contrived. So you have to do in a convincing way, in a way that's realistic that the character would act. Bring that character and all the characters along to that conclusion that is the end of your book. So that's why I always say it's more important to have an ending in mind when you start writing a book than a beginning.
Interesting tips. So, how can authors ensure their book's theme is clearly communicated and impactful?
Yeah, book theme. I think the biggest way of doing that is knowing what that theme is. Maybe even writing it down on a piece of paper and having it in mind. Different books concentrate on different things. I write historical uh, military books. So themes are things that I like to weave into it, but themes are not typically what drives my books. Plot drives my books, and of course, characters. Um, but that's not everybody. Like I said, I just read the the light that we cannot all the light we cannot see by Anthony Doerr. There's definitely themes in there, and you can tell that he had those in mind and he's weaving them in. So it depends on what kind of book you're writing. But I would say if themes are important to you, then write those themes out, and make sure you look at that every time you sit down to write, so that you have that in mind, and then you can figure out ways of working those themes in.
What role does research play in enhancing authenticity of a book?
Well, certainly in my kind of book, it's almost 50% research. It's if you're writing science fiction, I mean, I think there's research involved with almost anything. But when you write historical novels, absolutely. I mean, the one thing, I read historical novels, and the biggest thing that will take me out of a book is as soon as I see there's something wrong. And I I'm not saying I'm an expert in all things historical, but I know enough so that if I'm reading someone else's book and there's anachronisms, there are, one time somebody asked me to read a book that they were writing about the Civil War, and the author had like, there was a 14-year-old girl and her dad fought in the Revolutionary War right next to General Washington, and I'm like, that was over 100 years ago, or that was 100 years ago. Nobody who's alive in the American Civil War had a father who fought in the Revolutionary War, and if he did, the guy's like 100 years old, or very old. So, I think that knowing when it comes to historical research is everything, and I typically my system of writing is once I publish a book, I give myself a month before I start the next one. And in that month, not only do I deal with all the any kind of contingencies or problems with the book I just published, but I'm also doing all the marketing and doing all that, but I'm doing the research as well. So I am right now working on chapter one, the research for chapter one of my next book. And I think if you're doing historical, you definitely should have a certain amount of baseline research. You should understand the time, understand the overall how the world is at that time, but you can never know enough. So there's a lot of research as I write, and I believe in this. It's called just-in-time knowing, or something like that, or just-in-time learning. So there's a base of knowledge I need to have about the era I'm writing about, but I can never know what I don't know until I realize I don't know it. And so that's one of the reasons why sometimes I do only write like 500 words a day, because I start writing a scene and then I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute. Well, what kind of dress would she be wearing in 1866, for example? And now I got to stop and I got to go look that up. I didn't know I needed to know that until I'm writing the scene. So there's a lot of foundational knowledge you need to have. And then there's a lot of reading about the era and the time and the events before you start writing. But then once you start writing, and this is, I'm talking mostly about historical stuff, but I'm sure there's analogies to this in the other genres. There's a lot of times where I have to stop because I have to make sure. And once again, Daniel, this it goes back to the authenticity thing, because all it takes is one inaccuracy and you've knocked people out of the story.
Yes, indeed. But before we go on, Mr. Cody, I want to shout out my ranking tops in the last 30 days, because in Bhutan, I got number 6 on the Apple chart, Taiwan at 34, Jamaica 54, Cameroon 64, Thailand at 197, South Africa 115, Cambodia 131, and a lot more. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers all over the world, like Mr. Cody C. Engdal. So, Mr. Cody, let's talk about your new book, The
Yes.
Prussian Prince. How did
Yes.
you crafted it?
Yeah. Okay. So when we talked about plotting or outlines, I do have an outline for my whole series. So I'm writing a series called The Long Century, and it starts in the American Civil War, and it's going to go right now the way it's planned all the way up into World War One. So I knew I was going to write this book when I was still writing my first book, Rampage on the River. I knew that I I was writing an adventure series in which my character was going to spend a trilogy in the American Civil War. We were going to do a prequel, and then we were going to do this book. But the interesting thing is, Daniel, this book is not what I had planned back then. So back then, and this is in 2018, when I was first conceiving the idea for the Prussian Prince, it was going to be a book about the Franco-Prussian War, and I had certain things I wanted to have happen, but put a lot of that research off on a shelf because I had the American Civil War to do, and then I had the Mexican American War to do. So when I started doing research for this, I realized I had made some mistakes and misconceptions because I wanted to have something happen after the American Civil War in which my character would get involved in. But the problem is the things that I wanted to have happen in this book. The Franco-Prussian War doesn't start until 1870, and the American Civil War ends in 1865. So there was a 5-year gap, and the things in the plot that my character doesn't know or understand, I couldn't hold that for 5 years. I couldn't have him do nothing for 5 years. So I was like, okay, well, how do I do this? Well, maybe I make the book about the Austro-Prussian War, which happens in 1866. But even then, there were things that would work in the Austro-Prussian War, but wouldn't work there, that I would have to do, the things that need to happen in France because of my overall series. And so then I decided I was going to write The Prussian Prince as a 2-part book, in which part 1 was going to be the Austro-Prussian War, and part 2 was going to be the Franco-Prussian War. And as I was getting through it, I realized that everything I wanted to do in the Austro-Prussian, uh, I realized I was writing 2 books. I realized I was writing 2 complete books. That everything that happens in the Austro-Prussian War is a complete story into itself and deserves to be its own story. And, if I would have written it as one big book, we would have had like a 200,000 word book, and those are great. But honestly, like the way the industry is, the way readers are and publishers and all that, they don't want big, fat, war and peace size books. They want nice, tight 80,000 word books. So I decided that this is kind of the book. The title was what I always expected. But this is kind of a book that I didn't realize I was going to write, this book about the Austro-Prussian War. So so that's kind of how that came to be. But now that it's done, I'm extremely proud of it. It's a great story. It's, the character gets kind of bamboozled into joining the Prussian army. And we go through, how that happens. And then his experience from first kind of rejecting the fate that has been handed to him to coming around to some acceptance as he goes through training and as he starts forging bonds with other soldiers. And then they go off to fight Austria in the Austro-Prussian War, which is also called the 7 Weeks' War or the Cousins' War, because it's between, Austrians or Germans, basically. They're just Germans with a different border. And one of the things I like to do in my books is I like to have several battles in them, but there's always a marquee battle at the end. And so this book, the marquee battle, which is what you see on the cover there, is the Battle of Königgrätz, which now that I've really dug in deep, Battle of Königgrätz is extremely important, and it paved the way for the rest of our history. And to put it into perspective, there were 500,000 combatants between the Austrian Empire and the Prussians and their allies at Königgrätz. And I think like Gettysburg had like 90,000, and I think Waterloo had even less. So Königgrätz is huge in scale. And the biggest thing it did is, at this time, we're talking about the unification of Germany. So throughout history, Germany went from being a collection of tribes fighting against each other and then the Romans, to the Holy Roman Empire after the fall of Rome, which was a collection of kingdoms and dukedoms and duchies and free cities. Napoleon the First comes through in 1806, I believe, and destroys the Holy Roman Empire. There are different kind of loose confederations and collections of German states after that that are dominated by the Austrians. As Prussia rises as a superpower, they want to create a unified Germany, but they want to create one that excludes the Austrians. Now, the Austrians are Germans. They speak German and they're ethnically German, but they're Catholics, and the Prussians are Protestants. And also the Austrians are ruled by the Habsburgs, who have been, a ruling family in Europe for 1,000 years or so. So Prussia wants to create a Germany that excludes Austria, and at the time there's two ideas. There's a greater Germany which would include Austria, and there's one small or lesser Germany that would exclude them. So this war is basically a war of unification to exclude Austria from that unification. And of course, as you know, Austria and Germany will go into the 20th century as separate countries. This is the reason why this war and the Battle of Königgrätz is basically the battle that decides this war.
Interesting novel, Mr. Cody. So, what's the big difference of the Prussian Prince from the other novels that you wrote?
Yeah, so the Prussian Prince, the first three novels are American Civil War, and what we talked about, like setting, the American Civil War itself is a character in those books, and the fifth or the fourth book was a prequel about the parents of the main character Carl and how they meet, and fall in love, and end up in the Mexican American War. So the Prussian Prince kind of breaks away from telling stories about North America, about the American Civil War and the Mexican American War, and we start getting into European history, and like I said, a history that is still setting the seeds and the path that are going to lead us to World War One. So there's a lot of things in the Prussian Prince that we're going to see develop and grow until we get into World War One. And of course, I always say that in the future we won't say World War One or World War Two. We will think of them as one big struggle, or as I like to call the wars of the early 20th century. Uh, the Prussian Prince, um, it's still very much me. It's still very much my style of writing, and it feels like a book that I write. It's I think that's the big difference between this and the other ones, is that where we go with it, and we also develop some more themes and things that were coming up through the earlier novels. A lot of those things, a lot of the characters that you knew from the earlier books are back. Klaus, who's Carl's brother-in-law, he's in the very first book, Rampage on the River, where he's got a very big role in this. Carl's mother, Claudette, who's the main character of Mexico My Love, she's back in this. So it's connected to all the other books, but we're going onto new frontiers. We're getting into European history now, and the latter half of the 19th century.
Well, interesting, Mr. Cody. So, what are your struggles in writing The Prussian Prince?
Yeah, I think, like I said, when I sat down to write The Prussian Prince, I had imagined a kind of a different book. I had multiple things that I wanted to have happen, and I think I had too much that I wanted to have happen, and to put it all in there would have been kind of contrived. And I realized that I had a very solid conclusion for The Prussian Prince. So I decided to, like I said, to break it off into two. So The Prussian Prince is novel uh, novel number 5, and Sunday I'm going to start writing what I'm calling, this is a working title. I'll probably keep this title, but the next book is called the French Fiasco. And what I do at the end of The Prussian Prince, I kind of set up the French Fiasco, which will take the series into the Franco-Prussian War. So I guess that was my biggest struggle, was trying to do too much in one book, and finally coming to the realize, like, I'm actually writing two books, and I think it's better to write two 80,000 word books as opposed to like one big fat 160 plus thousand word book.
Can you describe the main characters or themes in The Prussian Prince that readers can look forward to?
Yeah, so the main character is Carl, And by the way, Daniel, to all your readers, you don't have to. I write each book as if you've never read the previous one, so it's great to read the previous ones, but you don't have to understand any of my books. Carl is a young man who grows up in Detroit with a single mother. He's there's money, but he's not quite sure where it comes from. He's kind of he's handsome, but he's kind of lazy, and he's kind of uh, unambitious. And he ends up being kind of sucked into the American Civil War against his own will. And in it, he has to struggle with his own fear that he'll be a coward when things happen. And he grows, and he's the kind of guy who isn't looking for a fight or looking to be a hero, but when he needs to be brave, it shows up. And in the Prussian Prince, well, in a previous novel, and we address it in the Prussian Prince, he goes back into the American Civil War for revenge reasons, and he gets it. And so at the end of the American Civil War, and by the way, the Prussian Prince, there's a little bit of the American Civil War in there because we do a little bit of the end of that. And Carl has now been through this horrible thing. He's got PTSD. He's killed people. He's seen bad things. He's had friends die, and all he wants to do is be done with war. He wants to come home. He wants to have a peaceful life. And he comes back to Detroit, and he's almost scared to face his family and face his wife because he thinks he's been turned into a monster. And he comes home to Detroit, and they're not there. And he goes missing in the during the war, so they didn't even know he was still alive. So instead of finding them, he finds letters saying, "We went to Berlin. If you're still alive, his mom and his wife is carrying his child that he didn't know. Come to Berlin and be with us." And so he's dealing with his PTSD and the experiences he has with the war. He wants to be done with it, but he gets to Berlin. He's got a brother-in-law named Klaus who is kind of an enemy during the Civil War books as well, who doesn't approve of Carl being married to his little sister, who kind of lays a trap to him. And so once again, Carl ends up being forced into a conflict that he doesn't want to be a part of. But in doing that, he doesn't want to be a hero, but he becomes one when it's necessary, I guess is a way to put it. And he's also struggling because, war is a violent thing and no one wants to be a killer. And, he has to struggle with that as well. Things happen along the way that he has a hard time dealing with. And he makes new friends, but there's also, which causes, new senses of obligation and duty, but there's also conflict there as well. So, he has to struggle through that. And also he meets Friedrich Wilhelm, the Crown Prince, who is a real person who I think is a magnificent historical character. And I really enjoyed having my character meet historical people like that in the tale. But by the end of the book, a lot of things happen to him, and so he's definitely a different man at the end of the book, and learns things about himself and about the world, I guess.
What do you hope readers will take away from your Prussian Prince after they finish reading it?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I got the corner market on Austro-Prussian War books. A lot of people don't even know about it. When I tell people I'm writing a book about the Austro-Prussian War, they're like, "What is that?" Very few people even know about the Franco-Prussian War, let alone the Austro-Prussian. And the only other novel I know that was written about this war was written by Alexander Dumas in 1867. Dumas is the one who wrote the Musketeers, and he wrote the Count of Monte Cristo. So The number one thing always for me is that I want people to take away is I want them to have a good time. I want it to be, it's in the end, ultimately it's an adventure. I want it to be a fun read, fascinating. I want you to be on the edge of your seat. There's a lot of like, oh, oh no kind of moments. There's lots of surprises and twists in it. But the other thing is that I want to make sure that that the history is all correct, so that most people won't go on to read a historical book about the Austro-Prussian War or understand its importance in the world that we live in today. So for me, I want to entertain people, but also, maybe I can pass some information about something that's very important and was one of the stepping stones on our way to World War One, which creates World War Two, which creates the world that we live in today.
Very well said, Mr. Cody. But before we go on, I'm inviting you to please do visit our official website of Food 101, www.food101.ca. And please do listen to our and my other podcast, Food 101, our fourth season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef and one of the five-star restaurant in downtown Toronto. So please do listen to our latest episode. We talk about polenta and ossobuco. So please do listen. And our books are out, not only one, but 13 volumes, people. Food 101 Volume 1, Basics until 13 is the only books that you need. How to create a delicious food. Available on Amazon and leading online bookstores worldwide. So, Mr. Cody, can you share a memorable moment from your writing journey that had a significant impact on the Prussian Prince?
I'll tell you this. I was in the American Army. I was in the 101st Air Assault Division. And air assault, if you strip away modern titles, it's just light infantry. And what is light infantry? Well, light infantry in today's world is not mechanized, not in armored infantry fighting vehicles and things like that. But in the sense of the 19th century, light infantry was like skirmishers, small squad level, platoon level tactics and things like that. And what was interesting to me is that when I write a historical novel about, especially about warfare, I don't just describe the battles, but I also like to go into like the tactics and the training and the weapons and things like that. So I did a lot of research into the Prussian tactics, and tactics are changing at this time. The Austrians are still fighting the way that Napoleon fought. Napoleon swept through Europe and conquered most of it with his tactics. And so after that, after being defeated by Napoleon, the Austrians emulated his style. Well, Napoleon was defeated in 1815. So by the time we get to 1866, things are different. Technology is different. The Prussians now have breech loading rifles in which they're putting the bullets in at the back and putting a bolt in there instead of pouring them down the muzzle and ramming them through with a ramrod. So the Prussians are beginning to come up with new doctrines of small tactics, and the way Napoleon fought was like huge assaulting columns where you just mass a bunch of men together and ram them into an enemy line. Well, that doesn't work. That works with smoothbore muskets that are only accurate at 50 meters, but not with breech loading rifles that are accurate at 1,200 meters. So the Prussians decentralized command. So they're giving before all the decisions are made at the top and then everybody just has to follow orders. Well, the Prussians are teaching their generals, their colonels, their captains, their lieutenants, their sergeants, their privates tactics and giving men autonomy. And this is really the birth of like small squad level tactics where squad leaders, platoon leaders, captains regimental leaders have autonomy in the field to make their own decisions, and if every man knows what the mission is, you have a better chance in allowing that talent on the field not to be a mindless drone being controlled by someone in the rear, but by being able to see opportunities and make decisions. They also start realizing the value of human life, so that not just march a bunch of men into a hail of bullets, but to use like fire and cover and fire movement, and so studying, which was revolutionary at that time, the Prussian tactics. I'm reading it and I'm like, these are the same tactics that the Prussians were innovating in 1866. This doctrine, these tactics were the same tactics that I was learning and having drilled into me when I was in the 101st Air Assault in the early 90s. So it was really interesting because, the American Civil War and the Mexican War, the tactics are different from, I mean, I do have military experience, so I can kind of understand it. But for the first time now, when writing about Prussian tactics, I'm writing about things that I learned. What's fire? What's the word? There's a term for it, but finding concealment, firing, and then moving forward. So you have, whether it's squads or fire teams or platoons, one team is laying suppressive fire while the other one moves, and then that one takes cover and lays suppressive fire while the other one moves, and it's like clockwork. And if you train every man from your field marshals down to the privates, they're all cogs in that machine. And if anything goes wrong, it's okay, because you have people who understand the tactics all along. And that was really something for the Prussians. Educating their soldiers was huge. And I'll tell you, it's one of the reasons why by the time we get to World War II, the Germans almost take over the world, because they have this unbelievable military system in which they trust the very low levels of their military all the way to the top, so that men can make decisions on the field and take opportunities and deal with contingencies as they happen. So I think for me, as someone who had been trained on modern day light infantry tactics, these are the same tactics that the Prussians were doing in 1866.
Very well said, Mr. Cody. So, how do you think the Prussian Prince stands out in its genre or category?
I got to tell you something. I'm an independent author, meaning I'm not published to a big commercial publisher. And what we mean by commercial publisher is, a big publisher like Simon & Schuster or Random House, Penguin, and all that. It's a big investment to publish someone through that. So they want to have something they know is going to sell. And that's why, like all the big publishers and all the big authors, they only write in subgenres that are proven. So the historical fiction genre is dominated by Romans, Vikings, or Nazis. And so if you are writing a historical novel right now and you want to get published by a big publishing house, you better be writing Romans, Vikings, or Nazis, or somehow try to put them all three together. But an independent like me can take risks. And if I went to a big publishing house and said, yeah, I want you to publish my next book. Great. What's it about? Oh, it's about the Austro-Prussian War. Come back to us when you have either Romans, Vikings, or Nazis. So what I have found is, American Civil War, there's a lot out there for it. The Mexican-American War, not a whole lot. I don't know if there's a whole lot of interest, but when I put out a book about showing, the Prussians with their pick a hop. Hang on one second, okay? Hang on. This is important. When I started showing, I don't know if you're going to do the visual, but I'm wearing a pickle hob, which is the the helmet that the Prussians were using at the time. It's got a brass spike. Um,
Wow.
and people have seen this, but they're like, "What is that? I've seen that before. That's so interesting. How can we never see that?" Because all you get are Nazis that don't come into play until like the 1930s, right? By the time we got Nazis, these are done. These are only ceremonial. This is what they are literally fighting in. And if you can't see this, if you're watching the audio version, I'm wearing a boiled leather helmet, shiny. It's got a big Prussian eagle on it, and on the top is a brass spike. And what's interesting about it, this is a very functional helmet. The spike has this one's a reproduction, so it doesn't have, but it should have venting holes to allow ventilation to come, heat to escape and fresh air. The purpose of the spike, I always thought the spike was because some of them still have these in World War One, but they're rare. Um, I always thought it was a weapon, so that like if people are jumping into a trench, there's a bunch of these to stop them. No, that's not what it's for. It's to deflect a saber cut. So because
Oh.
it flares this way, so if you're swinging a saber at me, the saber is going to hit that spike, and the spike is going to divert it off the helmet. That it's a very functional helmet. But what I'm saying is, um, it's very interesting. I mean, look at that. If you ever watch Hogan Heroes, that at the beginning of the show, they show a pickle helmet, even though they're not actually wearing them outside of ceremonial in World War II. So I have found that a lot of people are like, "Holy cow! I can't believe somebody wrote a book about this," because all they're getting are Romans, Vikings, and Nazis. And Daniel, I love Romans, Vikings, and Nazis. I mean, I don't like not they're bad guys,
No
but
offense.
they're interesting, right? And I just read a World War II book, but my feeling is that it's kind of an untapped thing. This late 19 or this mid to late 19th century. Kingdom of Prussia, and then eventually, after the Franco-Prussian War, will be the Empire of Germany. It's interesting because if you are into like the World War II and all that, we're walking towards that. This is the Austro-Prussian War is a stepping stone towards World War One and ultimately World War II.
Interesting, Mr. Cuddy.
Isn't that cool?
That's cool.
Yeah.
Cool, cool. So, Mr. Cuddy, can you invite our listeners, our viewers, to support all your novels?
Yes. Okay. So my name is Cody C. Engdal. It's a Swedish name, so it's got a funny spelling. It's Engd as in David AHL. You can find me on Amazon. All my books are there. I'm going to be at the Mid South this weekend, so I don't know when this is coming out, but this weekend I'll be at the Mid South Military History and Civil War show in South Haven, Mississippi, which is just south of Memphis. I'll be there all weekend long. I'm doing a talk called "A Brief History of the American Civil War Through Fiddle Tunes." I'm a fiddle player. Um, all my books are on Amazon. I am on all the social media, so you can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, on the big ones. The big ones for me are Instagram. I'm sorry, not. I mean, I'm on Instagram, but the big ones for me are Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I do a lot of YouTube lives now, at least once a week, where not only do I talk about my books, but I just talk about like book marketing and my journey. Sometimes I have other authors on. Um, I'm working on getting an email list. Unfortunately, I don't have that ready yet. But if you're listening to this, send me a friend request on Facebook. I still got plenty of space. I think you're allowed to 5,000. I'm out there yet. Give me a subscribe to my channel on YouTube. It doesn't cost you any money at all. And if you're interested in learning more, especially about the business of independent book publishing and marketing, I talk a lot about that. And yeah, I'd love to have the more friends I can have. Join the Engdalian army. My
Yes.
company's called Engdal House. You too can be a soldier in the army of Engdal House.
Yes, let's support the Engdalian soldiers, people. uh, and let's support Mr. Cody Engdahl because if you support him, more books to come.
Yep.
So, Mr. Cody, thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, Daniel, and everybody make sure support Mr. Daniel Lucas out there too. He's got a lot to offer, a lot of great podcasts and books himself. He's on Amazon. So thank you, Daniel.
You're welcome, and catch you next month.